I'm Angela Rodriguez. I'm the head of planning and strategy at Alma. We're the Hispanic agency from the DDB network, part of Omnicom, and we're the largest multicultural agency in the United States. We believe that insights drive creativity, and creativity that has good insights can emotionally connect with consumers and drive relevancy. And our planners and our strategists, actually led by Jackie Zima here, who's with me at the table, we spend our days thinking about culture in the US, globally, and really Latinx culture specifically, and how we can parse out nuances that will make those emotional connections. So we don't have a daily briefing like Sparks and Honey does, but we do have a quarterly digest, and we'd love for you guys to subscribe to it on our website.
Hello, my name is Merlin Uward, and you were watching Sparks and Honey's Culture Briefing, where we discuss what's been happening in culture for the last 24 to 48 hours. Or at least that's what we'd be doing on a normal day. This week, we're doing a three-part series on Latinx, today exploring Latinx as an identity and the influence in the United States. Joining me today, we have Camilo, and our table of special guests, as well as a few Sparks and Honey folk. And while we discuss the signals on the screen behind us, which come from our system queue, Mo, our illustrator, will be giving us live visualizations of our discussion points. On the screen, you should see our agenda for the day. Essentially, we're going to first jump into what exactly Latinx is, where it came from, how it's used, and then we're going to look at some of the influences across politics, culture, some of the efforts being done around inclusion, as well as education, if we get to it. I wanted to start off with some stats. The two I think that are most pertinent to our discussion today is that there are 58.9 million Hispanics living in the United States. And while a subset of them identify as Latinx, or at least use that as their term, they are also the youngest ethnic group in the United States, the median age being 28 years old. And it is, in fact, the younger folk who tend to use the new term. And we're going to get into exactly how our system identified this term in our search. To start us off.
Yeah, and I'll jump in. So if you're familiar with our system, we're mining signals from all over the place. We're looking at academia, we're looking at news publications, social media, search terms, so on and so forth. And what you see on the screen here is a result of the analysis of what are the trends from our mega and macro trend taxonomy that are most closely associated to this idea of Latinx. And I'll just share a couple of observations, and I wonder what the panel sees that's going on here. So for example, at the very top, we have outsiders welcome. We also have a couple of other terms throughout the chart here, like blur ID and taboo toppling, that capture the conversation around gender fluidity and intersectionality that's so incredibly important to the origins of Latinx. The second most important trend in the chart here is perceptual diversity. And when you look at the signals behind that particular trend, you see a lot of effort on behalf of the mainstream, especially in the US media, to understand Latinx, whether it's brands, political organizations, even Republicans, putting some effort into really understanding what it means and why it's important. And then you see a few other trends, like, for example, neo-celebrity and refresh classics, which are typically trends that are associated with meme culture, with younger areas of the population, where, I think it's an indication of the generational bias that's behind Latinx. So let me ask the panel, what else do you see in here? And perhaps most importantly, what are we missing here?
I think what I see in conjunction with the mainstream and also the bias will be the flattening, which has to do with the question that we keep asking ourselves about this is not a homogeneous group of people, and we should not address this group of people as just one origin, just one demographic. Mm-hmm. So I think that's why flattening is so strong there.
Mm-hmm. I'm also thinking about language, and I don't know if that's necessarily missing, but the evolution of language with respect to just the term Latinx. Mm-hmm. We were joking a bit earlier about how 15, 20 years ago we used the @ sign to represent the two genders, and X is taking us in another direction. But we're now seeing a generation that is also fluid, not just with respect to gender, but I think also language. The acceptability of Spanglish I'm of the Puerto Rican diaspora. We're well known for using both English and Spanish together. So, that's a great mix, I think, that should be added.
I think one other element of that fluidity is the fluidity between their Latinx identity and their American identity. We like to say they're 100% Latino and 100% Hispanic, and that's their joint identity today in the United States, whereas that wasn't the case before, where you had to kind of pick a side in the past.
And I'll add to that too, is in terms of racial diversity. So for example, I'm Afro-Latina, but raised with a Chinese father, and there's, my daughter came out white, so there's all this idea of what does race mean within being Latinx, and I think that that's wonderful, that that's not necessarily inclusion or not, whereas in my generation, sometimes that would X you out.
Yeah. And as you go deeper, like in culture, there's so much conversation about blanketing everyone, even with the term like Latinx. Everyone within that bigger group of Hispanics is so different from one another. Like there's this hashtag, for example, Embrace the Latinx, that bubbled up recently, and it's basically a celebration of all the diversity that exists within that community.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and in many ways, it's a term that could only be possible in the U.S.
Yes.
For a number of reasons. And one of these is because dictionary.com and Merriam-Webster Dictionary, as opposed to La Real Academia de la Lengua Española, embrace the term, right? And they bring it into the mainstream in their own ways. What's interesting is that in the last batch of words that were added to dictionary.com, we see a lot that are related to discussions around culture, identity, and social justice. So for example, Latinx was added in the same batch as other words like colorism, which refers to differential treatment based on skin color, which we're definitely seeing more and more in the news out there. So the question is, the term has been around since 2014, more or less, give or take. We have seen a steep upswing. Just looking at just simple Google Trends, for example, you can see the end of 2017, beginning of 2018, a very sharp increase in interest out there in the public as to what is this Latinx thing. The question is, like, why now?
I think we're getting so much more specific about identity, the parallel to the community. I'm also LGBTQ plus IA, and the companies I work with are really trying to be inclusive and trying to update their language. And it's kind of a long haul because we have multiple generations in the workplace. And we just got people over the hump of being able to say LGBT, and now we're throwing a plus in there and other more specific acronyms. But I think it's important, though, and companies know it's important to not generalize about a community, to be as specific as possible. And so the X reminds me of the plus with LGBTQ plus. We're in this stage where more language is better, and we all want to be called by our name and by how we identify, and as specific as that needs to be. So it really creates some interesting HR dynamics, because how is that scalable then when people self-identify in so many different ways? And then how do we gear workforce programs and support for such diverse communities within the diversity?
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that I think that there's a lot that businesses can typically learn from sociology and from the social work community, where self-ID has been a practice for much, much, much longer. And I think Jackie and Angela and I were talking about this a little bit earlier. We can't talk about the term Latinx without actually discussing the very queer origin. Camilla said, it started to enter kind of popular vernacular around 2014. I started seeing it in queer communities before then. I started seeing it in zines. I started seeing it in the, very queer and Latinx punk community. And so, there are certain understandings that we see flowing out of certain communities more frequently and entering the mainstream. And it's not a surprise that this is hitting more mainstream around the same time as we're having certain conversations around gender fluidity. It makes it both seem more urgent and feel more urgent because it is, but also is part of this larger discussion around how we each identify and how we carry these things with us in all parts of our lives.
Yeah, the origin's really interesting and actually bleeds well into our next signal.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we see the term entering more and more the mainstream, we see, for example, I don't know if you remember in the first round of Democratic debates, one of the nights, Elizabeth Warren opened actually with a remark bringing Latinx perhaps into a pretty big moment in what it is, mainstream culture. We have seen also other political figures embracing the term, and we have also seen, as expected, like with any conversation, right, some pushback around it, right? The pushback coming primarily, at least according to what we can measure, from two camps. The first one is sort of the more conservative, trying, the purity of the language, trying to protect a little bit the integrity of a language that's spoken by several 100 million people. And then the other comes actually from more of a feminist perspective that's seeing the word Latina, which it carries a lot of meaning, especially among the feminism movement that evolved out of the 70s, being a little bit taking a backseat to Latinx. So the question to the panel is, where do we see these tensions evolving? Are they clashing into something completely different and new that is Latinx, or are they going to be evolving into something, a different conversation?
I think there's one thing that we haven't addressed yet, and this fact that Latinx is really mostly a U.S. phenomenon to talk about people who live here, who have origins somewhere else. Right, and that's core to the otherness of being Latino or Hispanic or Chicano, Chicanx. There's a lot of words for this group of people, so we can focus in on Latinx and the gender implications and everything else. But if we back out a little bit and we think of this group of people and what it means to have their identity narrowed down to maybe one or two words, it's a much bigger discussion, I think, that we need to consider.
Laura, that's an experience you've had personally and recently. Could you expand on that?
Yes, I did. And I was having this conversation the other day, I think with Carmen, over the phone. It was about when I moved here, I realized that people suddenly decided to fit me into this box. And it was very critical for me to realize that I was not Brazilian anymore. I became like this checkbox, which is Hispanic, Latino, whatever.
Census box.
And the thing is, when I felt that I was losing my identity by checking that box, so I tried to preserve. That was my first reaction, trying to preserve. But at the same time, I started to feel weak. So being so alone, because it's not easy to be from this origin here in this country. So at the same time, I feel this counter movement that I suddenly started to want to belong to this larger group, because that's a way that I feel stronger. That's a way that I feel more empathy by others, and others can feel more empathy for me as well. So it's ambiguous.
Yeah, and we were talking about how I was born in Harlem and then lived in New Hampshire, and I multiracial, multicultural, but I also lived in Chile and Mexico City. And when I went to Chile in the 90s, it was a shock to be called negrita for my dark skin, which is actually a tan right now. But but I loved it. But here, my cousins were making fun of me for speaking white, and they thought I was too white, and it was a huge, huge shock. But I could see then how, for example, the older generations of my family would live here for a long time but keep their identities and their identity structures the way they were. And the tension that I see, because I operate within communities of older generations up until Gen X to Boomer to younger, is that there's this idea of you holding on to your ideas. So that's the split that I see when I see people who resist using Latinx. It's holding on to those ideas.
The discussion identity, of course, blends well with our element of culture, blurred ID, and we discovered another tension in our system as well. And although this element of culture, extreme safety, wasn't on the larger tiles, there were a lot of signals that were connected to it. There is a swarming of hatred around immigrants, particularly those from South America. And if you look at the intersection of this, what you find is that there's this interesting code switching that happens, similar to Carmen's experience, where you want to hold on to these identities, and you can move between them, and you use them depending on the situation you might be in. And unfortunately, some of those situations are hate-fueled. So this is a signal that explains that after a confrontation that was caught on camera of a gas station employee in Chicago telling a Hispanic person to go back to where they came from and ICE will be coming. They were fired. And in light of recent events, this is unfortunately not an isolated incident. This happens on a regular basis to people of color. And I'm actually going to hand it over to Angela. I think you have some specific thoughts on this one.
I think we can't talk about the Latinx community and not address the shootings in El Paso over the weekend. And really, this idea of go back to their country was cited by the perpetrator in his manifesto as the driving force behind his actions. And really, he called out, ironically, the fact that Latinos were blending their culture into the United States, which when we go back to the 1700s and we think about the melting pot of America as this ideal place where cultures could come together, we've talked about that as a mosaic or a tossed salad, where people keep their individuality but still coexist. So really the foundation of America is this coexistence and coming together of culture. So it's really hurtful to the community to be othered in so many ways, but then actually sought out and killed. And that's true of Latinos and the African American community, the Muslim community. We can go deep on all the communities affected by it, but certainly for Latinos, especially deep in Texas, where the border crossed them, they go back generations, they are as American as anyone else, and that's true of the people who are victims. They grew up here, their families are a long time here. It's hard to hear, go back to your country when this is your country.
And from the Latino community in El Paso specifically, there's a lot of conversation right now about that exact thing, talking about how they all feel as one collective family. And kind of in light of, awful events, you see this characteristic Hispanic optimism really shine through, which is interesting. It's, of course, a lot of anger, a lot of fear, a lot of sadness, but in the end also hope, where they're all lifting each other up. They're saying, Viva El Paso. You commonly see ex-city strong when a tragedy like this happens. And this one is just hyper supportive. And you see that because of the community that's there and how they identify with a place that's kind of given them their lives here and let them be who they are.
Yeah. I feel like we cannot talk about this shooting in isolation.
Yeah.
Like, yes, this is the shooting that is most visceral in terms of the extreme anti-immigrant sentiment. However, what we are talking about here is the fact that whiteness is policed. And that whiteness has, in the history of this country, been a target that has shifted. So we have a history of a number of people immigrating to this country and then being accepted as white over time because whiteness, as a checkbox, has shifted. However, we continue to police and exclude people of Latinx descent, people of Hispanic descent, and that is something that has held more firm. But there's an extreme anti-blackness to all of this, and there's an extreme focus on on race and how that phenotype presents on your skin, and that plays out across all of this. Like, we cannot talk about this without talking about white supremacy and how pervasive it is, and how connected it is in all of these places, and how diverse the community is, but how this still needs to be something that is unifying for for people in general, whether they are Asian American Pacific Islander, or they are Latinx, or they are African American, or they are any number of heritages. Like, this is incredibly important.
Yeah, if I could go back to this idea of connecting to place, right? So I've just returned from Puerto Rico, and we're seeing an awakening of the Puerto Rican people, not just on the island, but amongst the diaspora, right? And so this is a really interesting time to be talking about identity. One of the things that comes up for me with regards to census is our connection to our indigenous culture, right? And so one anecdote is understanding that in 2010, there was a big push in the census for Native Americans to self-identify. And we have seen tens of thousands of Puerto Rican people now acknowledge and identify as being Taino, where we have been told that our ancestry has been extinct, right? So when we think about the conservative conversation in particular, as well as the unfortunate violence that's coming with that, this is not, we can draw parallels to what's happened in history in terms of creating a system that effectively creates a genocide of a population.
And sticking with the geography discussion, deportation worries are something that are affecting the youth among the Latinx. And it's not just deportation of themselves, which is a legitimate concern for some of them, but most of them are US born, so they technically could not be deported, but their families maybe, immediate families could be if they're first generation. But these worries are affecting them and creating anxiety within the community that's deep-rooted, and it's partly because of threats like ICE is coming. But as many of you had already said, that this is their country, and it seems almost misplaced that this anxiety exists.
But it's also an easy place to channel your anxiety, quite honestly. Like, what I imagine is actually happening here is, like, you have, in this case, children who are internalizing hatred and are internalizing racism. And so it is getting channeled into fears specific to deportation, but it is a reflection of what they are experiencing in media, in culture, at school. And the place to channel it is in, fear of deportation. It's important to point out that Asian American Pacific Islanders were the #1 recipients of DACA, but we don't see stories about how, Asian American kids are worried about deportation, because that's not how they're internalizing these stories.
My white presenting daughter says is afraid that I'm going to be taken away.
Yeah.
And she says that to me. She said, when we see the headlines, after El Paso, she said to me, I don't want you to get shot. So it affects us every single day. And I've been pulled over in these things. But even way back, when I used to drive to the TV studio in New Jersey for CNBC, where I had my show, I was instructed to show up with no makeup, hair not done, so naturally curly. And they would pull over anybody who looked Hispanic. And this happened to me, and it didn't matter how much education, it didn't matter I was hosting my own show, it didn't matter. Everything, talk about flattening. Everything just goes completely flat when you're looked at through those eyes.
I think one of the key things that I would love the audience to take away is that this is something that matters not just at a personal level, but at a business level. People who fear being deported, who fear their family being deported, behave in the world in different ways. I have been to focus groups and ethnographies in Southern California for a beer brand where people tell us, well, we don't drink as much when we go out because we don't want anyone to lose control and be put in a situation where police are called in. We never risk a DUI. These are not things that our community does because we fear being deported. So it's not a theoretical thing about others who have to maybe live in fear. It's the choices people make and how they spend their money and where they spend their money and how they behave are affected by this fear in really meaningful ways.
I would take this signal to our element of culture, blurred responsibility, because there's a lot of consequences coming from this type of culture, and whose responsibility is to keep this culture going this way or change this culture.
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to add quickly, Walmart CEO, Doug McMillon, is in the news. People are asking him to step in after the weekend as the largest seller of guns. And the interesting thing about companies' values and making those manifest at times like this is you have this diversifying workforce, and they're waiting for brands that they trust and their employers to take stands on things. And so when they don't take a stand because legal tells them not to, or there's a lot of pressure on these CEOs, it speaks volumes, not to say something, not to do something. So I think that what I thought about was what kind of statement would it make, and what is the role of private enterprise and companies to lead in these conversations, to be courageous, to sacrifice some bottom line profits in order to signal to employees, you are important, you matter, your ability to bring your full self to work and feel safe here is important to us. And so I think we're going to see a lot more engagement on that, on all levels of diversity in the workforce. Companies really saying, this is a safe place, and whatever we can do to ensure that. You can't do that and not do that and say you're recruiting more Latinx talent. You've got to create the environment where that Latinx talent and all kinds of talent can thrive.
Excellent. Well, we're going to move into some discussions, happier discussions, about shifting traditions and blending traditions. And one such example of that is the quinceañera, which is shifting to becoming a voter registration opportunity. So it makes a lot of sense. You get all the tias and tios and cousins all in one place. And those that are of age get to register to vote. And in some cases, there are states that allow you even to pre-register as a younger person. But this is a movement from Jolt called Poder 15, which is basically Power 15. And the participating quinceañeras will actually get a free photo booth with this and a free Snapchat geofilter. So very youthful, and it sounds like a great benefit. So I wanted to talk about a little bit more about how these traditions have been shifting, perhaps becoming Americanized or being influenced by American culture in that way.
I think we can't talk about this without talking about voter suppression, which is very, very real. The voter rolls that are getting cleaned, especially in red states, disproportionately are specifically targeting Black folks, Latinx folks, folks who have very common last names, which, let's be real, is descendants of slaves or often immigrants. And so this is incredibly important, and I love that it is so youth-driven in terms of making sure that we can get people registered to vote, who may have already been registered but have been, cleansed from the rolls or, suppressed in other ways.
I love this as a means to empower a generation in a modern way, I guess. But if we think about what civic engagement means in this country, going back to census, right? We're needing to get over a fear amongst the community that is both citizenry and non-citizens, right? Those that are even undocumented to participate in a visible way. What does that look like, right? I would love to be able to take elements of this and transfer that to figuring out how do we help undocumented communities feel empowered rather than be succumbed by fear that most successfully is being driven by media and the conversation around the citizenship question. If anything, the conservatives have won, right? But how do we move the needle on this? So I'd love to be able to see how we can take more of these examples for that reason.
Call out just one other piece of this is how awesome that they're holding on to these traditions, right? In a world where people want Latinos and Latinx, all the names to kind of blend and assimilate, they're saying, no, we're going to hold on to this most traditional way of receiving adulthood for a Latinx woman through these traditional quinceañera, the ball gown, all the glam. I mean, it's pretty incredible.
Well, we had discussed a few times about the checkbox and the differences in the fluid identities and the many identities of the Latin community, Latinx community. So this is a wonderful Vice panel discussion. It focuses largely on the Trump voting and the conservative Latinx. But there's a section of this that I wanted to share.
Man-made borders. I don't care.
I'm very loud, sorry. There's a section in here where they go around the room and discuss how they identify specifically. And I think it's a very interesting thing for us to explore, so I'm going to watch that clip.
We talk about policies, we talk about immigration, but sometimes I feel like we don't even know how to refer to each other or address each other. We don't even know what the color of our skin means. So how do each of you identify racially?
I identify as Latin American.
Would you say you're white, brown,
I would say I'm white, yes.
Black, white.
Black woman.
Oh, white. I guess, right? Are you talking about
When you're saying check a box?
Like physical.
Like physical? Yeah.
But not ethnically.
Yeah, I would say I'm white. I mean, based on my skin color, but usually I'll put if there's a box for Hispanic, I'll put that. Yeah.
Just white.
This idea of checking a box can mean a lot of things.
Well, that's what she's asking us.
No, she asked how we identify, right? So my family.
They had a heated discussion earlier.
Right. If that's what you want to know, ethnically, Nicaraguan, American, I was born here, right? But my politics are very brown, black. I come from Indian people, period.
In the box, I typically put other. I'm native, I'm Pijao to be specific, and that's how I identify.
So I'm Nicaraguan, and for Nicaraguan, especially from La Costa Atlantica, the Atlantic coast, the Caribbean coast, which is indigenous, black, and Creole culture, I'm very light-skinned, and my family, I'm very light-skinned.
So has anyone here experienced racism?
So obviously very nuanced. You know, I think when we think about Latinx in America, we sum it up to probably only like 1 or 2 different countries at best. But it is a very rich culture, and there's also a very rich indigenous culture, as you saw. So I wanted to pick that apart and have you all go around and just kind of discuss that.
We, at ALMA, we've been recently working for actually the past few years at really understanding Hispanic Generation Z and also Hispanic millennials, because they are the drivers of culture, and as we saw from the data, the ones that there's the most of. And it's really interesting to see how they describe themselves and their identity over time as they get older, because you start seeing seeds of it when they're young, like too young to really even understand what they're saying or what it means. And you see as they grow older, it becomes increasingly important to them, not to be labeled, but as an understanding, and they develop a pride in being whatever mix it is that they are. So that's pretty interesting.
I just want to acknowledge how stress-inducing this conversation is for me, right? Because my shortcut is when I got to my Twitter profile and I decided to identify as Afro-Latinx, that was almost of convenience, because to add the LGBTQIA, right, would have taken too many characters. But it's a coming out story, right? Our decision to claim any part of our identity is a coming out story that led to cousins calling me and say, well, what do you mean you identify as African? Whoa, let's go back, people, right? So like, this is a stress-inducing conversation that we just need to leave space for that.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think that this is part of why your point on the census is so incredibly important. Like, Hispanic and Latinx identities are the only ones that live in combination with other identities racially.
Right.
So it is, and that is our half-bootied way of dealing with living in a post-colonial world. The history of colonialism is wretched and has left scars in so many places, but that is also the history of racial mixing. It's one of the reasons why the Black and Indigenous POC, the BIPOC title, is so incredibly important. And that is really at the core of a lot of what we talk about when we talk about intersectionality, is centering BIPOC voices and understanding our proximity to that or not.
Ben, you have a comment?
Yeah, this conversation is amazing. I just wanted to take it very quickly to this political level, because one of the things that you saw in 2018 was a huge surge of youth Hispanic voting across the US. It is part of what flipped the House to the Democrats, because you had this really impressive turnout. And there was kind of an interesting model shift there. For the past 20 years, the political model has been, how do we goose, for Republicans, it was like, how do we goose Cuban turnout in Miami? And for Democrats, it was, how do we raise Mexican turnout in Las Vegas and Puerto Rican turnout in Philadelphia to win those states? And at least with the Pennsylvania one, that didn't work for Hillary Clinton in 2016. Being too narrowly focused on that one part of identity was not successful. And so one of the things that you saw in 2018 was a bigger outreach to the Latinx community overall, recognizing that there are these particular verticals that you may want to reach, but that a rising tide sort of lifts all boats. And so I think that's super interesting in the context of this conversation about intersectionality, but also about politics, as to how do you speak to the more niche issues that may affect a smaller community in a specific geography, but also address people who come from a diaspora and lift those people up nationally. It's a balancing act, and it's a super interesting one, I think.
I mean, we all have shared experiences. I mean, Puerto Rican people are now experiencing a displacement unlike any population in the United States has ever seen, right? And but that is not unlike the immigrant experience, right? So how do we draw those connections? What it means from a civic perspective is to try and tell those stories that also undo what we've been told or not told, right? In 1492, there were 8 million Taínos. 8 million Taínos. Within 100 years, there were less than 10,000, right? What has that meant for an understanding of one's own indigenous background, right? Because to deny one's own history is to not understand those connections today.
Excellent.
And this is the huge, I can't even explain how big this shift is when we're looking at other generations. I mean, Kendra, back to your point in terms of colonialism and the history, seeing this in real, my daughter's Gen Z, and she very much strongly identifies as Latina, as Afro-Latina. She presents white, and she knows all this. We've had these conversations since she was 5. She grew up with Obama. Her cousins are black, last name's Wong. They identify as black Chinese. My house is crazy, so but we have these crazy, beautiful. But we have these incredibly intense conversations about the intersection of race and culture. And growing up, my mother's family was very, very upset that my brother's wife was black from Guyana. And then happy that I was marrying and divorcing, thank God, a blue-eyed man. But it was like these dynamics are there. But now that she's being raised and we are seeing history being unfurled, even though we always knew it wasn't taught to us correctly, they're really seeing it, and it's going to change a whole generation. I believe that, at least as far as it can reach.
So speaking of intersections, we looked at about 5,000 signals around the topic of Latinx and try to dissect them a little differently, see what other topics are associated to those signals. And not surprisingly, politics right in the middle up here becomes a bigger cluster. That's about 31% of all signals related to Latinx were also related to politics, entertainment following pretty closely, and entertainment being the topic of our briefing tomorrow. We're going to dive a little bit more deeper into that topic then. However, I want to say that looking behind some of the signals here, you see a theme that becomes almost pervasive across all the conversation. That might be an interesting takeaway for the audience, which is the idea of representation, whether it's political representation that we have discussed already, which is directly tied to the census, directly tied to voter suppression, directly tied to voter turnout, and some of the grassroots examples that we have seen, like in the quinceañera signal that we just reviewed. But also very interestingly, and for those of you who work in content production, entertainment, advertising, etc., is the representation in the media, right? And the idea of lack of representation of positive images of Latinx out in the media has a disproportionate effect in many things, right? And we'll talk about, if we get to talk about education, we'll talk about some of the effects that's having in graduation rates among college students. Another very important topic, and a great segue for the next signal, is the topic of family and identity, right? And most specifically, how identity is created, and what are the vessels through which we create culture and identity, right? Food being, for certain, one of them. And I'm curious, like, how many people in the audience here have ever tried lengua? Beef tongue. Okay. I mean, being a Latinx briefing, it's surprisingly low, but, respect for sure. So this is a signal where Angelica Martinez, a writer, explains to us a little bit her experience here. She said, food is still one of the biggest ways I feel connected to my own heritage. I don't need to be fluent in Spanish or have to grow up in El Salvador to appreciate a good slice of semita de piña. The love of chicken tamales at our Christmas Eve parties connects generations, born both abroad and in the US. I've found that food has a way of making a culture, be it my own or otherwise, feel accessible. So a couple of questions for the panel and the audience. I mean, why is food so powerful as a means to create culture? And how can we use food to bring us together across cultures at a time where polarization is pulling us apart?
Food is pulling people together. The hybridization of food, Tex-Mex being the quintessential American fusion food, but also when we think about the Korean food trucks mixing with tacos, and just the way culture comes together, the fact that we're no longer settling for inauthentic Mexican food in the U.S., right? We're looking for Oaxacan authentic meals. Food is love for Latinos. It's the way we express coming together, so that it brings culture with it is really not a surprise.
I want to bring that back a little bit to the brand conversation. Obviously, in America, there's also a bit of appropriation of that culture, right? We have Taco Tuesdays. We celebrate Cinco de Mayo for some reason. How is it that, how can a brand actively participate in that culture without seeming like pandering?
So I don't think brands can participate without actively discussing the history, right? So I think that, we hit on it where like food and cooking, especially, is a way that we connect and share love intergenerationally. This is oftentimes one of the things that we pass down in family from one member to another, and carry with us. And it is how we sometimes comfort ourselves. Whether it's a specific dish or just the act of getting into the kitchen. And once you start introducing brands into all of those feelings, it gets difficult and tricky a lot faster. It's just more rife for a space for screwing up. We've seen a million stories out of Portland about appropriation and things that are difficult there. But I think that there's a way to talk about what happens naturally. When you have people with different backgrounds, different experiences, different, love of food, moving various places and the things that we all enjoy, the things that you travel and bring back with you. There's a way to do that authentically. We just have to find the balance between the history and what we're enjoying in the present.
Yeah, and exactly. So not every brand can, talk about your great-grandmother's mole recipe, but maybe they can talk about what that means today to the Hispanics that are experiencing that recipe today, or maybe more of the blending. I think this ladders up nicely, this one too, to a trend that we've been seeing, or a process called gentrification. Gente meaning people, and coming from gentrification. And basically, it's when you see these upwardly mobile, educated young Latinos moving back to the neighborhoods in which they grew up, and bringing back and opening businesses and really shifting and experiencing their culture in new ways. So whether that's a restaurant that now has vegan chorizo, right? That doesn't happen in your grandma's house, but today it can, and there's space for that. There's space for that evolution.
So from vegan chorizo to vegan mofongo, right? Right. Yeah, I mean, and that's sacrilegious. Yeah, that was certainly a point of discussion around this one in particular. A new generation of Dominicans in the diaspora is embracing vegan and plant-based diets with a more socially minded focus. And this is like a made in the USA, only possible in the USA, perhaps one of the single reasons why the USA is just so amazing. It's not just the intersection of veganism and Dominican culture or food. It's also that many are spreading this newfound knowledge through a wide variety of means, right? Which speaks to the entrepreneurial spirit and what's going on here. So you have food collectives, meal prep services, catering, and cooking classes, which is like very maker movement for sure. This is obviously coming at the intersection of, climate change, changes in diet. The fact that, from a Latinx point of view, when you think about the, U.S. Latino, Hispanic, Latinx population is about 19% of the total U.S. population. When you think about millennials, it's 1 in 4. You go down into Gen Z, it's a third, right? So as you go younger, the numbers go bigger, and these new generations are embracing all of these intersections. So can we expect more food trends like this intersecting and perhaps even growing? And what are the implications for the culture at large, right? Once mofongo goes vegan, are we going to see it more in the Midwest, or are we going to see it more in different places of the U.S.?
As a Dominicana, I am so proud of this
Yes.
because I have been unable to eat a lot of Dominican food for health reasons. And I have cousins, and I miss it terribly, but I have cousins who basically become vegan as well, and they attempt to do these things too. And it's the next generation too. I think this is about health. This is about knowledge about how we affect the environment and how what we put in ourselves is important, but we want some connection to what we've been raised on or to our culture. Mm-hmm. And I swear, because I was just in Santo Domingo, we will see a vegan restaurant in Santo Domingo eventually. But I think it's just a different time and a different generation. I think it's very, very wise to invest in and see this as a future. It can't go away because what we're doing to the environment, what we're doing to our bodies is not going to go away. It's just going to get more and more intense.
Yeah. So I think it's important to point out again, like back to this history, right? So you start cooking with more meat, one, to flavor food, but two, as a sign of wealth.
Right.
So, we add the ham hock to the collard greens because it is a cheap cut of meat. It is one of the cheapest that you can get, and it flavors the entire pot, and you can eat pieces of it, and it is additionally nutritious. But like as we gain wealth, we don't need to add more meat to things. We find ways to kind of strip it out and make it more healthful. And so, we have to kind of tease out part of that history there where it is very much about us at this point, finding ways to reinvent things that are more healthy for us or work for us now, with the understanding that this came because we were making peasant food. And we needed to nourish a lot of people very, very cheaply. And there's a lot of import and a lot of pride in reinventing this peasant food and, quite frankly, serving it to white hipsters.
So I'm gonna block the next two signals together. So they're both related to festivals in different sides of the U.S. The first one is the Soy Yo Festival, which took place at the California State University in Fullerton. And the theme of this year's festival is intersectionalities within the Latinx community. So we have activities focused on being Afro-Latino in Latinx, being Asian in Latinx, about different genders in the Latinx community, so on and so forth. And the second is another festival that took place on this side of the coast of the U.S., which is the Afro-Latinx Festival in Long Beach. This took place at the Museum of Latin American Arts, and it's a festival that celebrated the Afro-Latinx culture, focused on cultural diversity and how art specifically influenced, coming from Africa, influenced Latin America, and therefore the Latinx community in the U.S. And the question for the panel is, we're certainly seeing more efforts within the Latinx community to dive deeper into its own diversity. And I wonder what we can learn from these efforts as Americans, and just what can be brought to the more mainstream culture. So to paraphrase and channel our AB member, Mr. Bing Chen, mixed race births in the U.S. have outpaced non-mixed race births, which means that people are no longer black, white, yellow, brown. They're all of the above. And how can we prepare to better understand this future? What is the meaning of diversity in a mixed race world? And is the Latinx experiment a good petri dish for us to put a magnifying glass and get some good lessons learned?
Well, it's already been said that even within the Latinx community, there's awakening of one's own identity, right? So I just came from the town of Loíza near San Juan in Puerto Rico, and in that section is the Afro-Caribbean corridor. And within that community is an understanding of the importance of agriculture and the preservation of the environment around it, which is, to me, a signal of what we need to manage through issues of climate change, which is to be local and to understand where our food comes from. And tied to that is understanding our own identity and the origins and traditions that unfortunately have been lost. We come back to this conversation around the impact of colonization, but it is true in all aspects of our identity, whether it's music or food. Our minds have been colonized as a result because we need to educate ourselves in how to reconnect with these things.
I don't think we can talk about this without talking about the very real privilege that came from denying these roots, right? Mm-hmm. So what has happened is if you could pass as white or you could pass as something else and there was more privilege conferred to that position, then you were going to be a Native American who's going to pretend to be black, because that's how you get to vote. So when we talk about this, we have to understand that there has been a lot of privilege associated to it. We have a lost line of Thomas Jefferson's descendants because they were white passing. So they still don't say, this is where we came from because they're white. And so, you hid your indigenous roots, you hid your black roots because there was more privilege in being closer to white or white. And that's something that takes a lot of work to actually undo in yourself as an adult, to rethink everything you've internalized literally your whole life. It's a lot.
Yes.
But we're seeing a real difference, I think, in young people today, despite the fact that America seems to hate them. They're, hashtag undocumented and unafraid, right? They're not going back into the shadows. We have data that shows that they're identifying more Latino than ever. So going back 10 years of data, it's an increasing number every year, people who identify as Hispanic in all its different iterations. And so that's really showing us that if it's driven by young people, older people, or just a sentiment of identity in the US today, people are not kind of hiding and blending and pretending to not be.
Yeah, there's a doubling down.
And that trend will probably continue into the future. One of the great things that our system can do is map our elements of culture over time. So here you see all the elements of culture that we had in the quadrant when we started. The vertical axis is prediction score, which is essentially what direction is the trend going, right? The higher up it is, the more action it's getting. And then the horizontal axis there is an energy score, which is basically how much conversation is happening or how much it's being talked about in the signals. And so what we can do is look 1 year into the future through our modeling process. And you can see that perceptual diversity and outsiders welcome go all the way up. It's going to be a very hot topic in just 1 year. And then blurred ID moves all the way from the middle of the chart to the end. So the fact that we're seeing more people starting to identify is probably going to hockey stick in the next 2 years or so, where we're going to see a lot more of that happening. And there's some interesting things that come out of that. There's a signal here that we have, which is about the visual archive of New York City's Latinx community. And this signal in and of itself is perhaps not that significant, but it sits among many other signals that are like it, which is essentially the celebration of that identity and putting it forth and putting it out into the world, either through archival museum kind of exhibits, or if it's personal, people putting together their family histories and celebrating that history and that connection to that culture. So that we wanted to highlight this one as a kind of an interesting piece of a larger movement that's happening that we're also witnessing.
I'm expecting this to happen and get stronger, because as we were discussing history is written by generations, and this new generation has the permission to rewrite some of the story and bringing more flavor, more color, and more of this discussion, like as part of the massive group identity.
Yeah. And you're saying companies and brands make more of an effort to show that diversity and be really representative. Getty Images came out with a Nosotros collection to include in their bank, and it's essentially, they got to it by interviewing like hundreds of different Latinos and taking their portraits and making sure that advertisers and brands have access to a more representative sample of this community.
Yeah, and there's some really good examples of that happening as well. The craft beer industry, for instance, which is predominantly white males, has done a pretty good job in just the last year of being more inviting to women, albeit mostly white women. So there is a diversity fix that needs to happen in the industry, and it seems that some breweries are at least understanding that and actively reaching out to and actively advertising to people of color, particularly Latinx, given that they are the largest of the minority groups and have a lot of buying power, honestly. So as a brand, that's really important. On the HR end of that, you also see people putting more effort into hiring that diversity, something that Jennifer Brown's very familiar with. And while these numbers are not staggering by any means, 5% is less than half of what other industries' current numbers are. So to set that as a goal seems a little strange. But the industry standard in terms of diversity is generally across any person of color. You see 10 to 15% of that being the makeup of that company, which isn't great either, given that that's much lower than the actual population. But it's at least on brands' radars, and that is something that they're working towards.
I can't think about this topic and not think about technology and our role in it. If you think about the workforce, which is absolutely important, we also have to look at the number and percentage of ownership of the infrastructure behind the technology that informs how content gets shared as well, right? And who sees it on the other side. And so, kind of back to this idea of blurred lines, I feel like tech begins to blur lines in a kind of a dangerous way, almost, where we begin to look at behavioral data rather than data that's driven by my ethnicity or culture. And so what does that mean for a year from now? Because of how quickly technology is.
So we're actually getting into the end of our conversation. I wanted to pose one last question for you all, particularly our guests, Jennifer, Jorge, Carmen, Jackie, and Angela. Now that we understand kind of the scope of the identity and that we have seen some brand examples, what is just a tidbit of advice that you might give to a brand or a person who wants to access this community and do it in an authentic way? Angela, we'll start with you.
I think coming to these sessions is like the baseline starting point, having those discussions openly and looking for ways not to do universals or to seek efficiencies by targeting and messaging everyone the same. It's really understanding the cultural nuances that are affecting how people make decisions at the checkout, and how they're choosing brands. So nuance drives salience, and you really got to get to the nuance. We can target people more minutely, to your point, George, directly one-to-one based on behavior, but if you're not getting that nuance of culture behind it, or you're giving everyone the same message because, same behavior, you've really missed the opportunity.
Excellent. Carmen?
Hire Latinx, and not just at the entry level, really has to be at a senior executive level. And if you're looking within and you have to hire people and promote people from inside, give Latinx folks the same benefit of the doubt, aka privilege, that you give the white males in terms of assuming that they are smart, that they are brilliant, that they will get the job done, and bring them up. Because if you don't have it at the top, it's just not going to be authentic. It's not going to work.
Jackie?
Mine was actually a combination of those two. But I think including more diverse people in your workplace leads to more diverse content and more nuanced content. And it creates just an openness to understanding more people in a more authentic way. I think brands, can stand a lot to gain by connecting authentically with this very diverse group, but there's also a lot of risk if you try and do it in a way that's too general, and then it leads to a perception of inauthenticity.
Excellent. Jorge?
Yeah, I think about transparency when I think about authenticity. And so I designed a course called Stakeholders in Marketing, which looks at 5 areas. It's not just customers, it's employees, it's suppliers, it's investors, it's community. Brands need to be interacting authentically with all 5 and be able to talk about how they're shaping all of those stakeholders and connecting with them.
Great. Jennifer?
Yeah, I'd say, with World Pride, I think there were more conversations than ever about pinkwashing. And so we know enough that the data shows us what we need to do externally, but the internal processes are critical. Who's making it up the pipeline? What's getting in their way? We've got to see it to be it. And so my passion is about raising a generation of diverse talent that feels that they can thrive somewhere. And that's the combination of what they hear, what they see, the career paths that they show that have been successful. And there has to be more power sharing. Brene Meyer says diversity is being asked to the dance and inclusion is being asked to dance. So be wary of bringing people to the table, but not involving them in a meaningful way, because that's when marketing nightmares happen, when companies get ahead of their skis and they actually haven't had the proper hygiene and consistent practices and authenticity and transparency and discipline, really, to knit different cultures together in the way that they do business every day. So brands are going to get in more trouble the more they sort of purchase and externalize this image without really walking the talk internally.
That's great. All right, well, that ends our discussion on Latinx for today on identity and influence. Thank you for joining us if you stuck with us for the whole hour on Facebook. If you'd like to be a guest here in the studio, you can go to our website and sign up to be a guest there. You can also RSVP for tomorrow's discussion on Latinx and entertainment on a link on our Facebook page. We do the briefings every day from 12 to noon and live stream this week, the full hour. And we'll see you tomorrow. Consider yourself briefed.